certain rate of profit, right? So the turning of interest rate to zero, which is quite unusual in the history of capitalist economics. And you would imagine after all the exploitation that they've done of humans and nature, but nevertheless, they're complaining that. So there is a crisis, and it's obviously that a lot of the fascistization of politics, it's also rooted into that. And I think that's a part of it. And then, of course, they can tap into this, reservoir of racism, because so many people in this country, I mean, there's a consistent amount of the population, whose well-being comes from, the history of expropriation and genocide, and they are there. And it's not the majority, but they are there, they're organized, and they can use the army, they can use the police, the institution, have been on their side in one way or the other. So there, I think it's where the dangers are. This is what the movement is up to, has to confront.
Absolutely. So we're about 5 after the hour, which is about the time we normally start. So Brian, should we hand things over to you and kick things off?
Sure. I just like to begin by welcoming Sylvia Federici to the ISE Intensive. Welcome, and it's my honor to get to introduce Sylvia to all of you. Briefly, Sylvia Federici is a longtime, really internationally acclaimed activist, teacher, and writer. Back in the 1970s, she was among the founders of the Wages for Housework campaign in the US and abroad. She's been active in the anti-globalization and anti-death penalty movements, was a member of the radical journal Midnight Notes, which is where I first started reading her work along with her colleagues back in, I think, the late 1970s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 79 he began, yeah.
Yep. After a period of teaching in Nigeria, she helped found the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa, which documented the struggle of African students against neo-colonial austerity programs. She's written widely on feminist theory, reproduction, the politics of the commons, violence against women, and capitalist accumulation. Her many books include the classic Caliban and the Witch, which is now translated into 19 languages, a collection of Sylvia's essays over many decades called Revolution at Point Zero, and 2 more recent books, one called Witches, Witch Hunting and Women, and the most recent, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin. Sylvia is joining us today from New York City, where she lives and currently works with a women's group called Feminist Research on Violence, which is also a website, and it's a space where women exchange materials, information, and plans for action on issues relating to violence against women, starting with institutional violence and capitalist development and accumulation. Welcome again to Sylvia Federici.
Thank you, Brian, and also thank you to you all, and to the people who are listening to us. It's really a great pleasure to be with you today, and also particularly at this time that I really feel this. I think we all feel it's a moment, an important moment of change, and for all the danger and all the terrible things that are happening, I think they're giving us, a few months ago, I often thought, oh my God, the last part of my life, I'm going to see a victory of Trumpism. And then this almost unexpected, much desire, but unexpected revolution. And I think it's very, very important. So today my contribution is to share some reflection, on an issue that I think is extremely important to the struggles today, and also particularly ecological struggle. And what I'm going to share are reflection that have come from meetings with a lot of women, particularly in Latin America, but also in the United States. And it's about the relation between feminism and ecology. And I'm sure that much of what I will say, it's almost common sense by now, but I want to make fundamentally, 3 points. One is that in many ways, you know, ecology, ecological theory, struggle, it's a continuation, it's on a continuum with feminist theory and practice. There is a profound connection between the two, you know, and also that you cannot have a successful ecological movement, you know, without today, unless the movement is also a movement against patriarchal relation. That the defense of the ecosystem, of the natural environment, it's very much profoundly rooted also in a struggle against patriarchal relation. This is what I'm going to try to show. And one reason is that today women in many parts of the world are in fact leading the struggle for the defense of nature, for the defense of ecosystem, against extractive politics, you know, against the politics that is continuously producing, you know, death. So I think, what should I speak about 40 minutes, and then we have a question period, or more or less how long should I, that would be, yeah, so.
Sounds good. Sometimes people prefer a little shorter in this format, but it's entirely up to you.
All right, well, I'll actually try to be very synthetic. And I would say, first of all, that the relationship between feminism and ecology is not a new one, obviously, because since the 1970s, with the rise of the ecofeminist movement, you know, this connection has been very clear. It was at the center of the ecofeminist movement. But at the same time, you know, I remember that the ecofeminism for a while was very much contested, because, you know, of the fear that it was relaunching and essentializing conception of women, you know, women being identified with nature as having a privileged relationship with the natural world. And today, on the contrary, you know, I think that those kind of conceptions, those kind of fears, anxieties, you know, have been very much brushed aside, because it is very clear that what is giving sustenance and what is giving energy and meaning to the connection between feminism and ecology, it's first of all the fact that in many parts of the world, across the world, we could say it is women in rural community, indigenous communities, as well as urban, who are driving the struggle. Who are driving the struggle for the defense of the environment. And there are many different reasons, you know, why that is the case. And I'd like to speak a bit to this question. I mean, a most obvious one is that women are those who are most impacted, you know, by, for example, the contamination of the soil, either by mining activities or by agribusiness or the construction of an electrical plant. And they are impacted economically, first of all, because having a much more tenuous, problematic relation with the monetary world, and not having access, certainly, to wage work, for good or for bad, they are more dependent. They are far more dependent on, this is a point, for example, the Vandana Shiva has often made in her work, right? The women have been in the forefront of the struggle because they have depended on the environment. And she has written very beautiful, powerful pages on, for example, what forests have meant in the history of India, you know, for women and indigenous people, how forests, for instance, are all entire reproductive system. You can almost live, in the past, you could almost live out of a forest in terms of fruits, herbs, medical herbs and plants, right? But of course, there are many other reasons why, and the fact that women are the primary subject of all reproductive activities, right? Also makes them those who are confronting most directly all the consequences. They are confronting most directly all the consequences of the destruction of the environment. And for instance, the contamination of water. Imagine when you have to provide for people reproduction, child raising, in an environment that is being completely degraded. This becomes a nightmare. And there are those also who in most communities are responsible, for the care of those who are sick, who are ill. And so they have to deal with all the illnesses that the contamination is producing. Not last, on the contrary, their own body, the reproductive system is profoundly affected. I mean, I've been reading now a lot of documentation coming from different parts of Latin America. One place, for instance, is Paraguay, where you find the Paraguay, so much of the cropland, has been turned into soya. And the soya, which is transgenic, is being cultivated with so many pesticides, herbicides, fumigations, and all of this, of course, seeps into the water and seeps into people's food, seeps into people's, and into women's body, to the point that now you have an exponential growth of cancers. You have children, right? The contamination is communicated through the milk, through procreation. You have children who are born with tremendous malformation, sometimes even blind. And thousands of people die every year of cancer, right? And so this is a very powerful reason. Not last, it's the kind of environment, social environment that is created when, for example, mining companies come into a town or come into an area and to begin extraction of petroleum, or when you have a process of deforestation, the environment, the social environment changes. Women from the Amazon, from Ecuador and the Brazilian Amazonia, they say that many times in the past they could go out even at night. A mining company arrive and they become afraid for their life. Men work very hard. They earn these wages. Usually it's young men who feel very empowered by the wages they earn. Often they drink alcohol because the work and the conditions are very brutalizing. And then, of course, they become much more violent against women. So there's been a registered, increasingly documented relationship, between the damage, the degradation that is done to the environment, and the violence that is perpetrated against women. And one aspect of this degradation, of course, is the whole contamination of food, the crisis of food. And here it's very, as a woman put it, and she said, as long as there's food in a community, you have struggle and you have resistance. But more and more, in areas that in the past, for generation and generation, they've been a source of sustenance and very rich in their product. Today we go hungry. Today we go hungry. And once you don't have food, it becomes more difficult even to have resistance. And the international company, the Monsanto, the Cargill and so on, they know very well, they know that to control the food supply, to control the world supplies, it's really a powerful tool, it's a powerful instrument to control people's life. And so it is not accidental, that today, for all these very different but all related reasons, it is very important to understand why more and more we find the women are now in the leadership. They are the ones who often coming into conflict, even with men in their own communities, are the ones who are most directly opposing, most directly resistance, the encroachment of the agribusiness and extractivist politics, which is reaching genocidal proportion. I think what is happening now, for instance, in the Brazilian Amazonia, there's a lot maybe in the discussion period, you know, because Bolsonaro has decided to basically take away, his policies to take away the territory. His argument is that indigenous people do not need this territory, you know, which is, if he succeeds, like, it will be really the end of many of these communities. Do not need them because all they need is some, you know, wage work. So this situation is creating now also a whole new organizational structure. And I think this is very important. One of the things which I think is so crucial to understand power relation today, and to understand the possibility for the future, is to see that, for instance, I'm more familiar with the situation in Latin America. You know, there's a whole set of network of women, that rural women, campesinas, indigenous, and of course there's a big overlap between the two, often with connection of women in urban areas. And there's a connection that, you know, it's expressed in very, very, very large movement. Second, very important, these networks, these indigenous, rural women's movement increasingly see themselves as feminists, openly as feminists, right? They are creating one way in which this is expressed is that they are creating spaces, you know, within often mixed movement, but they are creating spaces so where the women gather and they discuss their particular issue. And they can create areas that have an autonomy, and they have the possibility of decide where the struggle is going, you know, starting from a women's viewpoint, a feminist viewpoint. And this is because, as I was saying before, there's an increasing recognition, in a way, among this movement, that you cannot fight against extractivism, you cannot fight against the mining company unless you fight against patriarchal relations. First, because the ongoing, the wear and tear of machismo on a day-to-day basis, the kind of control, you know, the kind of oppression that often in the everyday life women suffer from men in their family, from men in their community, and the way their activity, their possibility of fighting also is limited, right? It's a major impediment, is an obstacle really to the struggle. You know, secondly, because as I was saying before, they see much more clearly than the men in their community, you know, the importance of not allowing these forces of destruction to come in, even though they temporarily seem to provide some improvement by bringing some waging, by bringing, of course, under the rubric of progress, right? Which is very attractive, particularly to young men who often have lived for years in unemployed, feeling disempowered. And so to them, the arrival of a mining company could appear as something that is positive. And so the ability, you know, for women to being able to stand up to the men on their community. And third, and this is also very, very, very important, and it's part of the struggle that is going on, you know, and is the fact that often the patriarchal relations that are often inherited also from pre-existing structure. For example, some indigenous community, you know, were far from egalitarian. Even today, you have that in Mexico or in Brazil, indigenous community may not allow women, may not allow women to participate in the assemblies, right? They might not allow them to be part of the decision-making process. You find that in many cases, even in communitarian regimes, even in regimes that are based on where the land is a commons, women do not have directly access to the land, right? They might work on it, but they might not be able to decide what will be done with it, right? Now, all of this is a tremendous problem, because it facilitates, the destruction of communitarian relations. It undermines the struggle. Why many young women leave? They feel that they don't have power enough in those communities, and so they might leave the community. And two, you have now all these neoliberal, for example, neoliberal politicians, or even neoliberal, feminist, women who are in fact part of the institutional structure, right? Who will come and will present a neoliberalization of the economy as in fact a social progress, because it will give women title to the land, right? So that these patriarchal structures are in fact a danger for the community. So the connection between defending the land, defending the forest, the waters, and struggling against patriarchal relations in all this form is becoming more and more clear. And this is one reason why you find, for instance, when you go look at whether it is Argentina or Chile or Brazil, the many now of rural women organizations, that in the past may have looked with suspicion to feminism, right? Today, in fact, they are declaring themselves feminists in a very open way. They are celebrating March 8th. They are actually seeing the feminist movement and as not only an ally, but as a power in their life. And I'm referring here, for example, to Conamuri in Paraguay, to the Movimiento por la Defensa de la Tierra in Mexico, in Chiapas, of course, the Zapatistas women here are essential to it. I'm referring also to the MST, in the MST, the landless movement, people of Brazil, they have women's spaces within them, women have created, and for instance, after the occupation of land, they have been the one who have insisted that people do not construct their farm, separate from each other once the land was gained, but actually continues to live in the same communitarian way in which they lived during the struggle for the occupation. Realizing that in fact that communitarian form of organization was very powerful, was what enabled people. Sharing reproduction is what enabled people, in fact, to confront, the police, the paramilitary, etc. And they are the ones who have insisted that those communitarian forms of reproduction continue after the acquisition of the land, right? Same thing with Via Campesina. So there is now a feminization. You can say there is a feminization of the resistance, but there is also a becoming feminist of the struggle and for this. And I think that this question is extremely important, not only for Latin America, of course, but beyond. And we have seen a similar phenomenon, a Standing Rock, for instance, Standing Rock, where those who organized the encampment, an encampment that was able to resist for 7 months in the most difficult condition, with the temperature 20 below zeros. And they called themselves the Defensores de las Aguas. And they're the one who organized a whole reproductive system that enabled the struggle to continue for months, as I said, in the most difficult condition. And this, I think, it's a point that is extremely important, which is that what we have seen developing over the last 2-3 decades, and this is something I wanted to just bring out in this presentation. Looking backward to the ecosystem, to the ecofeminism of the 1980s, and making a comparison with what is happening today in terms of feminist struggle and the relation between feminism and ecology. You have seen that there's been really a tremendous development where the connection is not made only theoretically, right? But the connection is really made very much in the practice. That in fact, it has been through the practice of defending the land, defending the water, organizing against the mine, organizing against, the construction of an hydroelectric plant, that the whole issue, the need to deal primarily and to deal as a central issue, with the question of violence, with the question of, the exclusion of women from decision-making power, and the whole reservoir of patriarchal relation. So I think that today, this is crucial also because given the whole history of involvement of women with reproductive work, right? What we see today is that, women have a particular strength in that they're capable of organizing a reproductive infrastructure for the struggle that enables their perpetuation and their growth over time. In other words, that the discovery, if you want, that in order to have a successful struggle over a long period, not a struggle that has high moments and then collapses, but to have a struggle that sustains itself and grows, right? You need to have also an infrastructure for it. I've often said one of the problems with male-dominated organizations in the past, many of the left male-dominated organizations of the past, has been precisely not understanding this fundamental requirement, right? That in the same way as the reproduction of the workforce, the reproduction on a day-to-day basis and generationally of the workforce requires a reproductive infrastructure. The same is true for the struggle, right? So that the ability, for example, right, to create forms of organization that can be sustained, because, for instance, people, women, and whatever, are bringing their reproductive work in common. They are creating more communitarian forms of reproduction, right? Which is what has been happening. When I refer to the struggle of the movements, feminist and ecological, again, Latin America, but you find it also in Africa, you find a proliferation of new forms of reproduction. They're really something quite, the popular kitchen, collective kitchen, the urban garden, where you have a connection there between countryside and town and country. We are told, for instance, that in many African capitals, the relation between town, the separation, the classic historic separation between town and country is collapsing because women are turning these metropolis, into gardens by appropriating pieces of land and putting their tomato, putting some onions, and they're transforming this area, right? The ability, and to create, above all, collective forms of decision making that are producing, new forms of solidarity, stronger affective ties, stronger solidarity ties. All of that, it's really now, common practice, in many of the movements that I was describing. And maybe I should stop here. I don't know how much time I have used, but maybe I could stop here and then we could have more discussion, more in details about these issues.
Thank you so much. While you were speaking, we had a number of people in the chat referring to some of their own experiences. A couple of people who spent time at Standing Rock, Apurva describing a demonstration she witnessed outside of in Delhi. Maybe some folks want to say a little bit about some of those experiences. If not, we can open it up to questions. I can take Stack, or if somebody else wants to take Stack, folks can. Cam wants to hear more about Delhi. I know it's very early in the morning there.
Hi, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the lovely chat, Sylvia. So we were just talking about our own experiences of witnessing like this extremely feminized resistance. And I'm sure all of you heard about the anti-CA and NRC-NPR protests that happened in India, only interrupted because of the COVID lockdown. So I was talking about Shaheen Bagh, the largest sit-in that happened in Delhi, and basically a group of older Muslim women occupied a very main interstate road in Delhi, and they essentially just set up camp in brutal Delhi winter, and they just sat there for the longest time. They were like, we refuse to let you implement this law that is essentially going to strip India's Muslims of their citizenship, of their claim to this Indianness. And this was, I'm sure, not the first time, obviously, but I mean, on the Hindutva right, the extremely Brahminical side, there's this entire chatter about like the docile Muslim woman and how sort of like the Muslim woman needs to be liberated from the clutches of Islam. So this was really the very powerful, the very independent Muslim women of India taking back that narrative and essentially saying that we will sit here, we are old and we are present, and we will feminize this entire struggle, and we will kickstart this resistance that has been long overdue in India. So that led to multiple sit-ins across the country, in rural and urban areas alike, and truly the sort of like vigor and hopefulness that you guys are witnessing around the BLM movement in the US right now is sort of what we experienced through this movement, which has to be credited to the women of Shaheen Bagh and the Muslim women who truly led this movement for over 2 months.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, which really fits in very well with what I was describing and with experiences that we are seeing in recent years, for example, in Brazil, in Ecuador, but beginning also in India, because, a precursor to that, and, probably I'm ignorant, but a precursor to that also was the great mobilization years ago that Indian women did in opposition to the construction of the Narmada Valley dikes. And at that time, thousands and thousands of people, mostly women with children, walked miles and miles and miles to go to the areas they were to be inundated with water, right? And stopping from place to place. And in the same way, something that we have seen more recently For example, during the government of Rafael Correa in Ecuador, women from the Ecuadorian Amazonia, right? That, you know, Rafael Correa prided himself to being a modernizer and constantly, like Bolsonaro today, although he was reputedly a leftist, attacked indigenous people and said, you know, that they should leave their mode of existence. Anyway, so the women again took the march. They marched to Quito for weeks and passing, and I want to use that example to show and connect it with the question of the infrastructure for a struggle and the question of reproduction. How do you march for weeks with the pots and pans and the children? And by the way, it's a very powerful form of struggle because you're passing through many, many villages, many places. You encamp, you tell people your story. You know, it's a way of connecting with people in the country and you're telling your story. Very often it happened in India, it has happened in Ecuador, it has happened in Bolivia when Morales was trying to build a throughway to the land of the TP. You know, people don't know. And this is a way of telling people what is happening. But you can do that because you have a whole reproductive infrastructure, because you know what to do with the food, with the children, with the water, with you know, all the daily necessities, the hygiene, the daily necessity of reproduction. And this is something that I think where, in a way, a form of exploitation, you know, women have been confined to reproductive activity, you know, and as an imposition, and it has been naturalized and it has been very oppressive. But nevertheless, right, it has also given women an understanding that connection with reproduction is given an understanding of people's needs. What life is necessary for the reproduction of life, you know, particularly when you're dealing with children, etc., etc. And so we have seen new forms of organizing, you know, emerging in connection with these struggles.
The person identified as 7EVPM2 had a hand raised.
Oh, thank you. Excuse me, it's Morad, and this name is a kind of auto-generated thing, so I couldn't change it. I'm so sorry for this kind of.
No problem at all.
I do really appreciate the whole intensive, and I really appreciate your talk, Sylvia. So I have, in fact, one comment and, in fact, two questions. I'm originally a Kurd from Iranian part of Kurdistan, which is eastern part of Kurdistan. And in fact, our life has a kind of intertwined with the story of dam building. So Kurdistan is a main source, kind of one of the main source of fresh water in the area. And then both in Turkey and in Iran, they have transformed the whole landscape, the whole environment into a reservoir, water reservoir for the nation. By nation, I mean the Persian in Iran and Turks in Turkey. So it is a story of land grabbing, water grabbing from the local communities, and the diversion of water toward the other part of the country. So, I have a very personal kind of experience with this story. For years in our village in Kurdistan, we were waiting for a dam that was supposed to be constructed near our village. And we were kind of living a very, very poor, completely substantial agriculture, which kind of fighting for hardly even making ends meet. So, and the majority of these work were done by women. It was a kind of agriculture, which, you know, the very basic labor first was so my mother and my sisters were very much, you know, important in, you know, regard to doing the agriculture than me and, you know, my brothers and my father. So, and it was very, very difficult years for them. So from my perspective, I know that dam building is a genocide.
Yes.
There is nothing about that can be defended at all. But from the experience of my sister, she was just simply waiting for years to these dam to just come and, you know, flood the land and just, you know, getting some money from the government and you know, and just get rid of all these back-breaking work in the field, in the kind of garden. So it is a very confusing story for me. I cannot. So dam for my sister is a kind of project which comes to liberate her from these breaking works, at least for a time being. And then, but so how these kind of bigger projects, a bigger picture of, you know, genocidal aspect of the project can be understood from these, you know, the perspective of ladies who are working in the field. So it is, excuse me, it was kind of too long. And my next question about Rojava. So it is a kind of curiosity. To what extent do you, Sylvia, understand, evaluate these projects in Rojava in northern Syria as a kind of radical movement which has the potential to liberate women based on women's rights? To what extent do you understand this movement, these, you know, project there as a kind of radical political system? Thank you. Sorry for the.
No, thanks to you. Thanks to you. I think it was very interesting. And I think, you know, in a way I understand. And well, look, what is happening, you know, I think the word genocidal, it's appropriate, because what is happening, there is in a way a genocidal program that is unfolding in the rural areas of the world. And the genocidal program has to do now with the fact that whereas the land has been used for generation and generation as a form of sustenance. And of course, we know that it's not, capitalism is not the first form of oppression, etc. But nevertheless, what you've been seeing, you know, and it's a long history, it's that has accelerated tremendously in the last decades, has been the constant and systematic expulsion of any producer, small farmers, cooperative, and so forth. You know, basically an attempt to sever the connection of people from the land, or forcing people to continue to work the land, but only under condition of total subordination as wage workers in the most backbreaking position, condition. And not only backbreaking, but now being an agricultural worker for one of these big companies in any part of the world is a death sentence. You know, I mean, I understand there are people in Argentina or Paraguay where when they do fumigation, they don't even tell you, they do it with the airplanes, right? In other words, agriculture, the countryside, they used to be the place of, you know, wealth, the regeneration, the contact with nature. What is more pristine than nature? Now it's a place that is full of poison, where the waters are poison, You know, the air is poison. And so I can see why, if you're working, you know, in a very, and even if you are now a small farmer, there is the way small farmers are being forced out is not only sometimes with paramilitary, which is happening, is not only by direct force, but it's also by a whole very, very insidious and perverse system of financial regulation. They make it more impossible, you know, for them to be able to make a living as they did in the past. And so in the end, you're forced to sell. In the end, even if you like to maintain, to stay on the land, you're forced to sell. So I can see that for many is a little bit, so for instance, you know, the reason for the fact that millions of people are leaving the land, migration, the great migration movements, you know, from Latin America, Guatemala, Mexico, Paraguay, etc. People are moving, coming to the United States, even knowing, or Honduras, even knowing that that journey is going to be very, very dangerous. And they're going to leave, well, we know the situation. Nevertheless, it's because conditions on the land have become so difficult, and they become political because there is a systematic process of exclusion. So your sister finds liberation in the dam that gives her a bit of money so that she can go someplace else. As many people take the road to migration, right? This is in a way, is a reflection of how perverse things have become. The people are making those choices, right? At the same time, there is also resistance. There is also resistance because there is an understanding that in many places there is no place to go, right? There is no place to go. That is very, very difficult because that money that she's receiving now, that appears to liberate her, you know, what will really gain for her? What will really gain for her? Once she will go to a town, once she will go, you know, maybe to a frontier and go to another country, right? So I understand, and this is, I was saying before, it's more common to find that often in young men, right? They will take a wage, perhaps more substantial than the money that people will receive by allowing their land to be flooded, right? But you know, it's a whole erasure of a culture, of a history, of a memory, right? It's a whole erasure of, and that's another important point that I think has come out from these struggles. You know, women have found, and I heard it expressed so many times, women have found that in those places where people were more aware of their history, people were more aware of the struggles that had taken place on the land, in the area, the capacity for resistance was stronger. And in that sense, more and more, they were integrating into the struggle the recuperation of the collective memory. Because in that recuperation of the collective memory, there was also the construction of a new common sense, of a new common interest, of a new collective subject, you know, so that in fact, you know, again, the whole struggle over the land, and this is why these struggles have been so rich and so important, has been recuperation of the memory, historical memory, and also recuperation of knowledges, of all kinds of knowledges that have been lost. Like for instance, now in Latin America and in the Caribbean island, a lot of feminist organizations, one of the first things that they do would be seed banks. You know, in other words, creating seed banks so you don't have to depend on Monsanto and you don't have to use transgenic seeds, right? And then there's recuperation of knowledges of herbs, you know, medical properties of plant, you know, having to do with the body, etc., etc. Yeah. So there is knowledge. Yeah, there is genocide. There is people speak now of a epistemocide, the destruction of knowledges, the destruction of memory, and there is a continuity between the defense of the land and the reconstruction, the holding on, because, you know, it's obvious, when you know you're connected to the past, you also give a different meaning to your own struggle, right? And you feel you're dealing with something that is bigger than you. And this gives you a lot of courage, you know, because it's very clear that when the struggle over the land today is one of the bloodiest, most violent in the world. And you look at Latin America, we heard about Berta Cáceres, but there are, you know, dozens and dozens of Berta Cáceres, and also of, you know, men's, indigenous, campesinos, you know, that have been assassinated. In Colombia, for example, since the peace accord, there's been literally a few hundred people have been assassinated, you know, in Brazil. So that struggle is a struggle that is extremely violent, and that's why, you know, the question of connecting with the past, you know, creating a sense of a collective subject, understanding that you're dealing with something that is bigger than you, so that even the loss of your individual life is not the loss of everything. You know, you're part of an extended body. The issue of the body, by the way, has become very important in the struggle. You know that the famous slogan, right? Mi cuerpo, mi territorio. Mi cuerpo, mi territorio, right? Which is, you know, many from feminist, indigenous groups are using the concept to say that, first of all, the body for a woman is as important as the territory, you know, as a first line of defense. You cannot defend the territory unless you also defend the body. And the other is that what you do to the body, you do to the land, and vice versa. If you poison the land, you poison the body. So that continuity, and continuity of which the body is our life, it's who we are. And that continuity with the land and the territory is the land, but is the land understood as a political ground. It's a land understood not only in natural terms, but also as a place for history production, as a place of collective activity. That's what the territory is about. So my body, my territory, right? It's so the struggle has many, many different, and I think it's important to see all those connections. Now, I'm very hesitant to speak of Rojava because I really don't know much about it. You know, I hear a lot what people have told me, but whereas I've spoken with women's organizations in the place, maybe in Brazil or in Ecuador. I've been I do not pretend to be a great expert about Latin America, but I had over the years a lot of connection and context and experiences. I haven't had that with Rojava. And so I'm much more, I know that there's been a great enthusiasm, you know, by also feminist organizations in the United States, you know, who have seen that they believe that they tell me that there are communities of women that are much more autonomous, that are very empowered. And so I'm very interested, sounds very exciting, but I don't have a personal experience of it. So there is something that I prefer not to talk.
Thank you.
There
And,
are-
you know, I've been in support of the Kurdish people struggle long before Rojava. And of course, you know, this is a struggle that I support, whether it is against the Turkish government or it is in terms of Iran. But I hope maybe one day might be able to have a more direct experience.
I'll mention that there are a number of people in our circles at the ISE who are experts on the movement in Rojava. I would recommend folks take a look at entries on our website by Eleanor Finley, by Debbie Bookchin. There is at least one other person who's written. I posted a summary of a talk by Dilar Dirik, who's a Kurdish woman who spoke at a recent social ecology conference in Greece last fall. So the description of that talk is also on our website. So a lot of resources that people can access, as well as many other articles in other places that are quite good, and some documentary films that are also very good on the movement in Rojava. Anybody want to add anything on Rojava before we go back to the stack? There are two other people on the stack.
I could say something briefly.
Please.
You know, I also am not intimately involved with the Rojava movement, but I have many friends who are. I'm quite close to Debbie Bookchin, and who's been a few times and is very intimately involved. And what really strikes me is that from the inception of the movement to create democratic confederalism, one of the first principles they had was gender parity, which is kind of amazing, that they were going to have gender parity at every level of leadership, and could not start a meeting if there was not both a female and male there to lead. That this is one of the, and it's really an amazing kind of discontinuity or rupture with what often happens in most mixed, whether they're in the Middle East or in Europe or the US, people can make a pretense towards feminism, but not really follow through. In Rojava, the commitment seems to have stayed throughout. Women, they fight in the army. They really have decided that this will not work. This will have no integrity. This will have no future if we don't interrupt patriarchy as best as we can at all levels, both within the movement and in the private sphere, the home, the family. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. Debbie, that's one of the things that she says, you know, I'll complain sometimes about my own organization or the own movements I'm in, and you know, how we've, at least in the US, how we've fallen so deeply. I used to be very, very involved in the feminist movement, international feminist movement, American, and we've so lost ground, feminists, here. And she's like, they're kicking ass in Rojava. Like, the women are at the center of everything. You know, she says, I don't want to romanticize it, but at least in principle and structurally, women they're really holding that. And, you know, God bless them, they're up against, you know, hell. But it's pretty remarkable, particularly in a very, you know, it's remarkable wherever it happens, and it's remarkable in Rojava.
Joe, would you like to add anything? You said you've been working with the Kurdish women's movement.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I was just writing in the chat. I was not being prepared to speak. Yeah, I was just writing that this thing about what they call the co-chair system, where you have like a man and a woman. It's actually not just a man and a woman either. It's in the system of Rojava, which of course we have to remember is built on 40 years of struggle, like a 40-year strong like liberation movement, which has had a very, very strong women's movement inside it, struggling against the patriarchy in the movement, as well as against you know, colonization and genocide and all of these other things. The Rojava Revolution is really a manifestation of all of that struggle and all of that political organizing in every village, in every community. The the co-chair system, yeah, so it's also like, it's not just a man and a woman, but it will be a man and a woman of two different backgrounds, for example, like a Christian and an Arab, or something like that. And it's really about like learning to work together with somebody who's got a different background from you. So like the man has to learn to share power with the woman has to learn to take power from the man, and the woman is also organized in her own, you know, assembly, which is supporting her and standing behind her as she's organized collectively as well. So it's, yeah, I think it's easy to sort of see it as a kind of like liberal representation model, which of course is like the kind of thing that is held up here as like, oh yeah, we're against patriarchy, look, there's a woman doing this like a man's job or something, but it's actually like more about this kind of deep transformation of relations.
Thank you for that. Jeff is on the stack, and then we will go back to Apurva.
Thanks. I'm Jeff, and I'm in interior British Columbia, and I'm a third generation farmer. And when you're talking about like the need to have secure access to food and whatever for a movement to work and whatever, that's something I, in my experience, have found is quite weak in North American movements. Like, I find that there's not a lot of emphasis on the, okay, we're going to create change and or create these intentional institutions and stuff, and food doesn't seem to come into it enough. Sometimes it does, but I just I kind of wanted to get your opinion on whether you think that that we are kind of in North America have a weaker connection between activism and food than in places like Latin America, because that's, in my experience, that's kind of what it's felt like.
Yeah, well, again, it's one of those things that for me is not so easy to speak about, because the United States is a continent. It's so huge. It's very difficult to know many things that are happening. But my sense, I understand. I would say, yeah, makes sense. But I think over the last years, I've seen that growing more. I mean, there've been, of course, the whole experience of food not bombs. That was very, very important. And, the United States also has some of the craziest and most perverse laws, I think, in the world. Because I don't think there's any other part of the world where it is forbidden legally in many places to distribute food for free to people. But I know that in many places in the US, they've used hygienic laws to prevent. I know that many that were working with food not bombs, encountered that they were being prosecuted, for distributing food. But rather than that, I think in more recent years, there has been a trend also by people to connect with the land, go back to grow some food. I know, for example, in New York, the experience of Woodbine. I don't know if you're familiar. They came out of Occupy. After Occupy, many people didn't want to go back home. They didn't want to go back to the kind of, fragmentation. And so there were two trends that came out of it in parts of New York. One was to move in an area of the city where people could be more together and they could act politically, in a sense, to create a sort of territory in the Latin American sense of the concept, of a place for collective action. And the other trend connected with it was to go to, say, upstate New York, get land, grow food, and with that food, and we have seen it in more recent period, in more recent weeks, a lot of the food came, for example, as part of the mutual aid activities that were created in the city to make sure the people are there. So I think that the need has grown, and I think that the experience of COVID probably will give new energy to it, because the question of people not having access, the fact that so many people are hungry, this constant, tales, seeing the long lines of people waiting to, a package of food that many times is nothing, because you have this pasta and tomato paste, and it's nothing really nutritious. And the fact that we have all these food deserts, right? In so many of our cities, the Black neighborhoods are food deserts. So I think the consciousness is growing. I really don't know, quantify, how present it is. In my experience, in my media experience, I would say that the issue of food is present. Perhaps I'm more connected with a lot of women's groups, and the issue of food is there. But I think that what has happened in recent months, now has given it even more importance, right? Both in terms of access, because many people are still starving, and secondly, in terms also of the quality, because what we are eating, it's poison. I was on a Zoom with Gustavo Esteva, in one of the Zapotec leaders, and one of the elders of the Zapatistas in Mexico. And he was saying, well, today, those who are not starving, who are not dying of hunger, are dying of fear of the food they eat. And he is right. They are dying of fear of the food they eat, because you don't know, what is gone into it. There's so much deadly, so many deadly substances that go into this food that explain the epidemic of cancer. We are talking about the epidemic of COVID. Why we don't talk about also the epidemic of cancer? Many more people die every year in the United States and in the world of cancer than they die of COVID. This is not to minimize. This is not to minimize what this epidemic is, but to say that since the interest of the multinational companies, right, is to continue this very, very lethal kind of food production, nobody talks about, the consequences. Why cancer today is, and even COVID. COVID is, has inroads into bodies whose immunity system is destroyed by the fast food, by environmental racism, by the contamination of the air. Somebody told me that you could probably make a map between the places where the air is most contaminated and the places where you've had more people dying of the pandemic. That in many areas, because the contamination creates lesions in the lungs that facilitate the entry of the virus, right? So, I mean, this epidemic is a classical example of a system, a social system that cannot reproduce, the people that presumably, is supporting. And it's a major crisis of social reproduction. When people say this system is killing us, in a way, the COVID has been a classic example. And I think food is a center of it. I hope, well, we have CSA, community supported agriculture. That has been a very important activity. And I think it has spread across the country, but I'm sure a lot more needs to be done.
So,
yeah, definitely. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, definitely with COVID has been, as much as I don't want to say COVID's a good thing, it's been a good thing for food activists. I think, like, when as soon as JBS had to close their plant in Alberta because of a COVID outbreak, my phone was ringing off the hook. Like, oh, do you have beef or lamb, or it was like, it's springtime, they're all babies, so no. But like lots of people, it was a wake-up call. This has been a wake-up call, I think.
Yeah, and you know, one thing that I know, and I think is really important here, you know, because we have heard of you know, the story of the chickens and the contamination in the companies, in the assembly line, where chickens are being, you know, processed. But where I think we need much more broad education is also what is happening, what is being done to the animals. And I know we have animal liberation, and there's been a lot of courageous people, and many have paid with a lot of years of jail. But I don't know that the majority of people, or even a sufficient number of people, have an idea of how horrendous, how barbaric is what is being done to the animals. That they are, you know, eating cows that never, or veal that never had the chance to stand on their legs, because the fatness, they have been fattened so much that the bone structure does not support the fat. And that, you know, I read stories that raise your hair of these animals being pushed with electrical shock to the slaughterhouse, and they fall, and their bones break because their body is not sustaining their weight, and not to mention all the experimentation that is being done on animals, right? And, you know, when you look at that, I mean, it's another moment of truth. COVID was a moment of truth on this system. And I think looking at what is happening to animals gives us a new insight to what is also being done to us. Because the level of barbarity, you know, it's a symptom of the problem of this society.
So Apurva is next on the stack, and then both Katie and Meg cited some interesting examples in the chat, if either of you want to make a comment. And then there was, I think, a very important question from Christina.
Good.
And then Laura.
Hi again. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself when I spoke earlier. I'm Apurva, and I'm a researcher based in Delhi. So Sylvia, I sort of want to go back to when you were speaking about how there's this creation of a new organizational structure amongst indigenous communities in Ecuador and Amazonia in Brazil, which is sort of helping build these spaces of autonomy for women, and then in return sort of trying to break the very temporary allure of neoliberalization as progress, that you move elsewhere outside of indigenous areas and you can claim land, and therefore those areas tend to be more feminist. So I'm trying to, I'm not extremely familiar with this, but I was hoping if I could learn from you about what these new organizational structures have looked like, and how we can sort of decouple the feminization of these communities from our understandings of Western feminism. So what has this feminization looked like within indigenous communities?
I think in indigenous communities, what it looks like, for instance, I mean, there's some really very important books. Usually, a lot of it is in Spanish. For instance, there is a book that has come out recently by a Guatemaltecan feminist that comes from the highland area of Guatemala, the area of Totonicapán, and she's written a very important book on this issue. You know, she's one of those indigenous feminists who are very concerned that some of the patriarchal structures of indigenous communities are playing into the hands of the privatizer, you know, of those who want to commercialize the land, right? And first of all, she describes how communitarian relation and have been important, you know, for her community to keep the land for 500 years, despite many attempts by the conquistadores and more recently neoliberal companies, and to destroy, to take over the land, to commercialize it, right? So she is very, very committed to maintaining the commons. But she also points out that in her community, which is a very large indigenous community, the land is transmitted by mail line. The fact that it's transmitted by mail line, for instance, this is one example, but is indicative of the struggle that is now taking place in indigenous communities, in many indigenous communities. So the fact that the land is transmitted by mail line means, for example, that if a woman marries outside of that community, her children are going to lose access to the land. And this is not true, for example, for men. So men can marry anybody they want, but women do not, right? So this is one example where already it creates a tension, because you have younger women, right, who do not want to be in this situation. You have other communities where, for example, women are not allowed to be participating in the assembly. For example, in a number of Mexican indigenous communities, right? They might be able to do all kinds of things. Women are central to a lot of the reproduction of the community, but they are not allowed to participate in the assembly. She's arguing this in not only the long run, but in the short run, is going to destroy the community, because it's going to give power to all the forces of commercialization, of neoliberalization, get the title, etc., to prove that, you know, this is where progress is going. This is what progress looks like. Progress looks like break down the community, individual titles, so women can have a title too. And she's saying, well, this actually is a preparation for the loss of land, right? It's a preparation for the loss of land. So they are fighting within the community to deal with that, right? They're fighting within the community, to deal with that. So one of the things I was saying before is that in a number of these networks, for example, the ability to have women's spaces, to have women to form an autonomous space within the broader movement, to decide to provide a feminist perspective, to provide a women's perspective. It's a very different feminism. I mean, you know, I don't go for Western feminism. I don't like the notion of Western feminism, because Western feminism is like, there's so much difference. So I guess I would fall under the category of Western feminist, but you know, I'm not one of those who love to go to the United Nations, who believes in the power of the United Nations to emancipate women. In other words, I think we have to differentiate also in terms of feminism in Europe, in the United States, and etc. We have to differentiate, because there are Marxist feminists, there are radical feminists. I'm a little uncomfortable when it's like, or like black and white feminists, or Western feminists and you know, non-Western feminists. These monolithic categories, I don't think do justice, right? They don't think to do justice to the realities. But certainly, what is happening in Latin America is a more what is called popular feminism. It's a feminism that is rooted very much in a struggle to change the material conditions of life, to change the relationship to the land, to change the relationship to work, to access to resources, where that is very primary, right? It's also a feminism that is anti-colonial, right? That has the knowledge you know, and anti-capitalist, because you cannot be anti-colonial without being anti-capitalist in a way. Well, no, that's not true, but certainly when you see the history of colonialism, you see that this is what is, coloniality has been one of the key structural characteristics, you know, of capitalist development and domination, right? So it's a feminism that is very rich politically, that has a very strong anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, because, yeah, and also sees the struggle over the land, you know, and for the natural environment as fundamental, as being the basis of all, as it should be, as it is. Because once you've lost the land, once you've lost the forest, once you've lost contact with the water and the seas, etc., because let's not forget the seas, right? You have no control. You have lost one of the most powerful relationships that you can have, you know, in your life, you know, with the means of your reproduction. And so the loss of land is really the loss, well, as the indigenous people say, once you lose the land, you lose your soul, you lose your body, you lose your soul, you lose your history. You know, the land is the places where you construct your history. And if you are on the land as only as a you know, a totally subordinate person, right, without the ability to actually interact with the natural world, right, it's far, far more difficult to wage a liberation struggle.
Thank you.
Did Katie or Meg want to say something brief about the comments you posted, or should we continue with questions? Okay. Christina, do you want to say the question that you posted in the chat?
Sure. Hi, I'm Christina from Peru. Yes, we're aware, right, that relations in rural areas are very unfair for women. Men control capital, land, they control crops that are sold to the market, while women are in charge of the crops that are just for home consumption, the garden, right? So I was wondering, what are your takes on these government? I mean, you just talked a little bit about this, on these governmental programs that are like maybe giving land to women, or like promoting these women group credit groups, or facilitating the incorporation of women to these value chains, or even cooperatives, you know, to impulsate the insertion of women into the market. So particularly I was interested in learning your perspective, given the urgency, right? Because like organizing may take a long time. So if you have any hope on these type of programs that, given such unequal conditions, that do they help at least temporarily?
I'm not sure that I perhaps made myself clear. I was not thinking of, I was not putting hopes into the kind of program that institutionally have been created, right, to deal with women's poverty or women resources. On the contrary, I saw usually the programs that have been instituted as a disaster, right? For instance, you know, the most pervasive program across the world, I mean, in fact, it's happening in the United States too, but mostly in Latin America and in Africa, it's microcredit. And microcredit has created a whole population of women who are completely worse than when they took the credit, because they now have a lot of debt. Yeah, they don't, not only they don't have any money, but they have a lot of debt, right? And this has been pushed by the World Bank and by many, many organizations. And so I don't think that the institutional programs that presumably are addressing women's poverty have actually done their work, right? What I'm talking about is rather women organizing from below to contrast, resist expropriation, contamination, the degradation of the environment, and two, in the same process, in fact, coming out of it, constructing new relations, right? The two are very closely, they are inseparable. You cannot really successfully resist the kind of onslaught that is now taking place without at the same time revolutionizing relationships in the community, without strengthening communitarian relations. Because the forces that have been unleashed against you, I mean, I was talking about how many women and men have been killed, how many leaders of campesino, indigenous people. I don't know if you heard recently in Brazil, this man who was burnt alive, you know, and he was a campesino leader, an indigenous person, very well known in his community, and he was burnt as a witch. This was a man, he was burnt alive as a witch with the instigation of people from evangelical organization. It just happened about 10 days ago. There's been a big, so I was talking above all of the fact that from below, there are movements that are both feminist, indigenous, rural, that are dealing with the land, and they're seeing that doing so from an anti-patriarchal perspective, you know, it's a necessity. It's not only a power, but it's a necessity. Because in order for women, it's something very similar to what women in the United States discovered, you know, at the beginning of the feminist movement. To fight against capital, you have to fight against your father and your brother and your lover many times. Not always, but many times. When your father said, oh, or your lover or your husband, no, you don't go out tonight. You cannot go to this demonstration. Look at the people you're going with, etc., right? In order to have the kind of autonomy that enables, in space, that enables you to decide your struggle. Many times that struggle has to begin in the home, because the home is being organized as a place of control over women's bodies, of control over women's work. You know, I mean, I think the whole male-female relation is being organized. I mean, that's where all the binary, the function of the binary has been organized as a system of supervision of women's work. Supervision and with the power of punishing, you know, if women are transgressing. So that's why domestic violence has never been considered a real crime, because it's part of the discipline of women so that they can do all the work of reproducing the workforce, right? So that we learned in the women's movement that you cannot fight in a way against capitalism in the same way as the Black struggle. You know, the moment in which whiteness becomes also a way of, you know, disciplining people in the Black community, imposing, you know, stronger, more intensive, more barbaric forms of exploitation, then you have to fight against a system of race privilege, right? It's the way capitalism is divided. I always say that capitalism is not only the production, you know, the accumulation of capital, it's also the accumulation of differences, hierarchies, division. And it's not only division, it's that you have one sector of the oppressed controlling the others. I mean, I think women have a very profound understanding of it, because we have seen how difficult it's been to make a struggle. When the person saying, no, you cannot do this, is your husband, is your father, is not capital, is not a boss, an open boss, but is somebody who now is invested of the authority of the state, is invested of the authority of the state. you know. So this is part of the struggle. And I think that, you know, the movements that I was describing, you know, the fact that they are acknowledging, right? They are acknowledging that, and they are, you know, incorporating the struggle against patriarchy to see that corporate power, capitalist power is also patriarchal power. And as it is a racist power. So the racism and sexism have to be fought simultaneously. You know, I want to make the example here of the Zapatistas women. I think it's very interesting what has happened and very powerful, right? For a long, long time, the Zapatista movement was always identified, you know, with the male figure, right? Marco, romantic, the pipe, the mask, etc., right? Well, now that the women have much more power, we understand that from the very, very beginning, they were central. For instance, in the first years of the Zapatista movement, they were able, after they take over in San Cristobal, they were able to impose this revolutionary law on women, which was really unique, right? Which basically said, you know, established the women have certain autonomies and established the women have, you know, right to equality, etc., 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 are not forced to marry. This was done because of the amazing work. That there is a powerful book called Compañera. Right now I cannot remember the author. In this moment I have a blank, but that describes, it's built all on interview with Zapatista women, and they describe the work that they did, you know, to have the law pass. Not only, they were able to pass a law that has made Zapatista land dry land. You know, there's no alcohol. All in Zapatista land, you can, officially, you cannot have alcohol. Because they, for example, you know, the many indigenous people traditionally were not paid in money when they worked in the big fincas. They were paid in alcohol. So payday came, basically half of it was alcohol. And so what do? You work very hard, you get drunk, right? Then you get drunk, and when you get drunk, all your misery explodes, and you vent your violence on the person who is closest to you. And so the women realized that mechanism, and they went from village to village to village. So today now, actually, we see that the face of the Zapatista movement has become more and more the face of women. You know, because in a way they are the ones who are carrying out the most of the reproduction. Now, this is not to recreate hierarchies in a new way, but there's something to be said that the engagement with reproductive work, it's something that gives a centrality to certain struggles.
So Laura is next on stack, and then Julia.
Hi, so I wanted to thank you for bringing up the animal issue, because I do feel this is very relevant to this subject, and I don't know how we can have this conversation without looking at that. I have been really doing a lot of research on the connection between the human domination of animals and patriarchy and the formation of patriarchy, and specifically a lot of the traits that we associate with patriarchy, the emotional stoicism, the compartmentalization, the control of reproductive systems, the control of bodies and movement, and how really there's a lot of theories out there saying that this may have originated in animal agriculture, because they were literally controlling the bodies and movements and reproductive systems of animals. And of course also, you know, it was necessary to compartmentalize emotions. You know, if you're gonna slaughter an animal, you can't feel the empathy for that animal. So it kind of forces you to have to do that. And it was always men that were in that role, and still, you know, pretty much today are still in that role. I actually grew up in a small New England farm town, and I actually literally have a farm across the street. And I started thinking about this really even in childhood. You know, seeing the way that, you know, even with like 4-H, for example, or boys that grow up in agricultural environments, this is really a big part of their social conditioning is, you know, all of this. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if you feel that there is a connection there, if that's something that you've really explored or looked into at all. And oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is also the domination of animals in terms of their behavior, conditioning them, you know, breaking their spirits. And, you know, again, this parallel with breaking the spirit of the woman, you know, to make her, to literally domesticate her, right? Domesticated animals, domestication of women. There's like a lot of really strong parallels there. So yeah, I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're right. There's a big relation because, you know, women have never been seen as completely human, right? There's have been all those kind of beings in between the animal and the human from the point of view of capital, in the same way as Black people. You never, you know, and I've done this work on the witches, right? So the witch, she was the one who lived with the cat and with the dog and flew on the horse, right? So it's all this idea that you're not a completely human being. It's part of the demonization. And of course, it has to do with the fact that the animal is seen as something totally, totally brutish, right? And, you know, I've written, and some of the work and research I've done, I discovered in another culture, in other periods also of European history, you know, animals were considered as sentient beings.
Yeah.
You know, having in some cases even the power of speaking. So the animal talk, right? Etc.
Yes.
And then with capitalism, there is a complete separation between the animal and the whole notion of reason and the higher and lower faculty. So the body is the animal and the mind is in fact, you know, the higher spirit. So a disembodied human who doesn't suffer, who doesn't. And then you have a body which is instead the animal that has to be disciplined, has to be kept under control, has to be repressed, right? And then of course that animalization also characterizes whole population, indigenous people, women, or certain classes of women, and Black people, brown people, etc. Gay, trans, all those were non-conforming, right? And most important, I mean, because that is the key, were destined to particularly intense form of exploitation. Because that kind of dehumanization is not an end in itself. It has this particular end. It's that you can exploit these people with more brutality, more intensity, and more accumulation. Because you can classify them and you can represent them as being not completely human. So for example, you know, they circulated this theory about animals in the 17th century that they do not suffer. They scream, but the screaming, if you kill them or hurt them, the scream is a mechanical thing. It's not a real suffering, because real suffering is only a human thing, right? So you create all this justification, but in the function, for the function, right? And I think that, in fact, with capitalist development, each new phase of capitalist development, look, starting now with the present, you know, introduces more barbaric forms. I mean, some of the description of today's farms are the most barbaric that you can even imagine. You know, what could have been done to animals in the past? It's surpassed. You know, the fact that now they are forced, you know, you have pigs, so they are forced to produce twice as many, you know, pig than the whole productivism, keeping the lights on in the barn so the chicken can keep producing eggs, fattening animals so they cannot even walk. Some never get up on they always sit in their shit, literally, until the day they're going to be slaughtered and filled with antibiotics, so presumably they don't poison us. There's a level of barbarity that you wonder, you know, when you work in this situation, what happened to your soul? What happened to your spirit? So I think you're absolutely right. And the thing is, we are on a continuum. You know, I think there's now a realization, and there's a beautiful book by a woman. We are now realizing that to say I'm not an animal is the wrong position.
Yes.
It's the wrong things to say. It's not to say, oh, I'm not an animal, you know, because that means accepting the same devaluation. Right? And is instead beginning to recognize that animals have their own dignity, they suffer, they have emotions, and they have the right to this earth as much as we do. They are our companions. And not only the privileged one, you know, our little pets, but actually all animals. And I think that developing a culture where we do, that is life affirming, right? That is capable of honoring and recognizing and interacting, you know, in a way that is not destructive with what is around us. This, I think, is the big challenge also of the struggle, right? You know, bring down capitalism, but bring it down also creating a different conception of the world and our relationship with humans and with nature, including beginning with animals.
Julia's been waiting quite a long time, and then there are 3 other people who have either posted questions or asked to be on stack that I'll maybe get all 3 before we have to wrap up. We have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll make my response short.
So Sylvia, first of all, I'd like to thank you for all the knowledge you're sharing with us. I'm from Brazil, and even though I'm from Brazil, it's such a huge country, so I've never been to indigenous communities. My experience is within the urban area, and I've taken part in women's collectives, because I believe that in Brazil, it's a little bit easier. I mean, women's organizations and collectives and mutual aid groups have spread throughout the country. And I've worked along the women from MST, the Landless movement you've mentioned, but I've been away from the organized women's movement for a while, because even though we have this history of organizing collectively, women's movement has taken a major proportion in here. Most of the collectives are attached to political parties, and they are connected to the institutionalized left, and they end up reproducing the hierarchical structures that oppress us. So I wanted to know what are your thoughts on how we deal with the reproduction of the hierarchical structure in women's movement, and how to prevent women's collectives and groups from being co-opted by a reformist and neoliberal agenda? Because women's struggle in Brazil has been totally dominated by reformist perspectives, and we actually end up spending our time and strength worrying about and putting first the symptoms of the major problems, then putting in practice ways to overcome these powers and structures. So these are my thoughts on that. I just wanted to listen to what you have.
Yeah, well, you know, I've been a few times to Brazil. I was in Rio, in Sao, and then more recently, actually, I was in Bahia. We had a 2 days gathering with a lot of women from different places, mostly a lot different struggles around land. Women from Belo Horizonte, and I would say, first of all, that it's not true that there's a lot of women's organization, feminist organization who are not within the parties. So I understand that, but in Brazil particularly, because the PT was quite powerful, right? Before the rise of the right. So this is a long discussion, and it's one that I feel not so, but I would say that there's, as you know, in Brazil and in Latin America, there's a big discussion to what this progressive government, right, have meant, and whether they in fact have opened up new possibility, if they meant a step ahead. And I think overall, people have looked at the PT as in a more favorable light than other progressive government. But there's also a big sense that in many cases they have limited the autonomy of political movements, right? That there is a danger of estatism, Now, in terms of women, my experience, I've connected with a lot of women's groups, of feminist groups that were not inserted into political parties. So I would say that, you know, probably looking towards the future, I think that that autonomy is probably going to grow. I mean, I don't know, you have women like Marielle Franco, for instance, and the response they came to her assassination, right? You will see that this was not institutionally controlled, right? And Marielle Franco was not really, I mean, it was very important, it was fantastic woman, but it was not unique in a way. There's also a network of women that both in rural, indigenous, as well as urban areas that I think are working outside of the party. That would be my response. And I have very anti-statist position. I do not trust the state, although I realize that you cannot ignore the state. You have to fight with it, negotiate with it. You know, they have the land, they have a lot of the wealth that people have produced into their hands. So you cannot ignore the state, right? At the same time, and it's important also to fight for what you've been able to win from the state. At the same time, I think it's very dangerous when you expect the state to organize, reorganize, and improve, you know, our lives. Because particularly now, a lot of these, many of these progressive governments have been very, very involved, for instance, with neoliberal structure. There's been a leftist neoliberalism. I think even in the case of Morales, you know, in Bolivia, there's been a lot of criticism of Morales before this fascist coup, but there was a lot of also criticism because many times he gave concession to mining company, lithium, and so on. They went against the autonomy of indigenous people. So I think it's very important to really stress and work in the direction of creating, empowering more autonomous forms of reproduction, with the knowledge that you cannot ignore the state, because the moment you want to take land, the moment you want to change, you know, housing, control over urban space, then you immediately have to deal with the state. You know, throughout Latin America, for instance, when people are forced out of their, you know, their land, you know, the rural area, and they go into town, they take over land. They take over urban space. They create the Villa Miseria, they create all these encampments which eventually became huge communities, right? And where they often create forms of, I'm not saying self-government, but more built from below and more self-managed, right? With a lot of contradiction, because of course it's a struggle. So I think there's a lot to be learning about, you know, look, there's a very, and here I want to connect what I'm talking about with the discussion that is going on today, right? Across the country about defunding, dismantling the police, and creating alternative forms of community safety, right? That is an important part of that reclaiming our lives. Right? And I think that here, for instance, people can learn a lot from what has been done in some indigenous communities, you know, where there's been the process of self-discipline, if you want, right? Not necessarily as normative in all cases, but there's been more of an effort to build something from below and not from the state. So that's where I think the effort should be going.
So we had, I'm sorry, I forgot your name again, 7EVP has your hand up. And then there were very...
It's Morad. So sorry
Morad.
for this. Oh.
Yes. And then we had really important and inherently open-ended questions from Wildheart and Paula about ongoing strategies for the feminist movement. So I wanted to give the two of you a chance to say what's on your mind, and then those three comments and questions can shape Sylvia's concluding comments. Murad, you're on.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So in fact, my question is related to this idea that capitalism is not just, as you said, it's not just accumulation of capital, it is accumulation of differences as well. So it is very great for me, so we know that how these differences works against each other to subordinate someone in the interest of others. So all these capitalistic relationship between differences, but at the same time capitalism is a kind of a machine which produce more sameness than differences. So it is a process of homogenization of communities to make them more and more like each other, to make them more controllable. So how these two kind of different aspects of the same process can be understood. So it seems a kind of contradictory at the first glance, but for me, it seems that it is two different aspects of the same process of, of this subordination. Thank you.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. I mean, I don't think that there is a process of sameness. I mean, like, look, the commercialization of culture and the commercialization of food, the commercialization, all of this, right, in fact, gives the impression of a great homogenization. But then when you actually look at the most vital conditions, when you look at health, when you look at life expectancy, when you look at housing, when you look at employment, when you look at the access to resources, right? So the homogenization occurs at the level of consumption. But then who has access even to different forms of consumption? And when you look at the most fundamental you know, again, health, housing, and so on. Well, you see what we have seen with COVID. You know, COVID has really brought to the light all the inequalities of this society, right? And all yeah, the different forms of discrimination, whether it is, you know, Black and brown people or elder people who don't have resources, because if you have, you know, substantial property, then you don't end up in one of the nursing homes, right, where 80% of the people there may die, right? So I think it's very important to keep an eye as to what are the conditions that are fundamental, actually, for people's lives. And it's true that the equalization of culture, and even that, you know, has its own limits. Because, for instance, going through many of the Black neighborhoods you hear in New York, you will find the bodegas that you find is very different from Whole Food, right? It's very different what people have access to. No?
So we're actually about at time. I would like to take an extra 10 minutes to get these last two comments and Sylvia's response. I hope that's okay with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So Wildheart and Paula.
Yeah, my question was just about like dismantling patriarchy and how that looks and how that happens, and especially in a women's movement where there's so much power inequality and dominance over women. How can women remain strong and protected where they're not, like you said, like being assaulted by aggression and force and like rape and domination?
And Paula's question is related and equally open-ended. Are you still here? IDE, Paula?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that my name is different on the chat. My question was just talking, I don't know, in the beginning we were talking about the ecofeminist movement of the past. And I was just wondering if you thought that there was a future for a successful like second wave ecofeminist movement. Yeah, that's just a very general question.
Sylvia, you're muted now. You need to somebody.
How did I do that? Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So we could spend another hour on just those two questions, but okay. Let's try to.
I will say that, you know, I'm one of those who likes to see a continuity between what happened with the ecofeminist movement and with the struggle that are today. You know, I would say often that, you know, I was not comfortable with some of the excessive criticism against early ecofeminism as being essentializing. There was some of that. But when I think of Mary Mellor, when I think of Maria Mies, when I think of Vandana Shiva, these were women who always had in mind, you know, they always had in mind the material conditions of life, right? But I would say that today, what we see today, we see something that in a way it's broadened from that ecofeminism that often was theoretical, more theoretical, right? And now we have seen an ecofeminism that is really rooted into the struggle themselves, that is really receiving a new energy, a new strength, right? And is now spreading also through different population of women, you know? And I would say indigenous women, women from rural communities, right? Who in a way have been brought to feminism, you know, by the logic of the struggle, And so that continuity between feminism and ecology that I started with at the beginning of my presentation, that really unfolded and was created in the logic of the struggle, right? You cannot fight this unless you are part of an assembly. You have to be part of the assembly so you can say no to the mine, so you can say no to allowing an oil company to come and drill and a fracking company to come and drill in your territory, etc., etc. So I would say that today, that question of the relation, you know, often it was placed as women and nature. It already was problematic. But now, women and ecological struggle, feminism and ecological struggle. Today, it's really part of the, it's part of one of the most important, you know, movements in the world. That is not only a movement of women, but I would say women are very much into the front line. And it's really a movement, you know, to save the most important conditions of our existence, you know. And the other question about the forms of domination, yeah, we are in a system. I mean, we are seeing now. I think the last 3 months have been incredibly educational, right? And it's not that many of the things that have come to the surface were not known, but in a way we have seen them articulated in yet new ways, and also in ways that demonstrate how profoundly rooted they are in the institution, in the fabric of this country. I mean, when at the peak of an upsurge, a revolt, you know, against the killing of unarmed Black people for the most trivial reasons, yeah, you find, you know, cops were tear gassing, were killing, were repeating the same action, you know, for which people are revolting. Then you realize, you know, how rotten the system is, how in fact there is everything has to be changed, not only the police, not only the police. So I think that awareness, it's now, I think, being demonstrated, the broadening of that awareness, the awareness of the injustice, the awareness of the history, right? And the history of racism is very connected also with the history of sexism. And we see that people are revolting, and there is new ways in which people are beginning to organize. New demands that 5 months ago I would never have imagined possible. The creation of autonomous zones, you know, dismantle the police. Critical resistance was fighting for abolition, and you know, it was great. I very supported the abolition struggle, but I honestly thought it would take a long time, and now it is being taught. It is being taught openly on a broad level, which already changes the, so it seems to me that what we are witnessing is giving us a great courage and warning against the tendency often we have to say, oh, you know, my God, it's so bad. How are we going to change it, right? Or some of my students used to say, it's too late. It's gone too far, right? And I think we have to say, well, you know, we can never say that, because, you know, new children are born every day, and what kind of world we are creating for them. As long as we are here, we have a responsibility for everything that happens around us. But what we have seen recently, I think, is extremely encouraging. You know, I said I feel young again, and I leave it here.
Well, that is the perfect note to end on. We had one quick question about a reference from
Okay,
Matthew.
good.
Yeah, just real quick. Thank you so much for being here with us. And a while ago, you mentioned a book by a woman in Guatemala that was written in Spanish.
Yes.
And I think just a lot of people were wondering about the name of that book because it sounds
Can
really
I
interesting.
send it to you? It's a long book. It's like three lines. Can I send it to you? Can I send it
Sure,
to
yeah.
Brian and then he can put it on a website?
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Put it right in the chat
The
here.
name is Gladys. The name of the woman is Gladys. Gladys with D-Y-S, Gladys.
Sure.
Sul. T-Z-U-L. T-Z-U-L. Gladys Tsutsul. And Tsutsul. She is from Totonicapán and an indigenous community, and she's also, she's a scholar, is a theorist, and is an activist, and she's one of a whole generation of young women coming from indigenous communities who do not want to go to the path of land privatization, who are very committed to the commons, to communitarian relation. And one of the greatest things about this is that she described very powerfully, right? What does it mean, communitarianism? What does it mean to grow up in a system where you don't have a political structure above the organization of everyday life, where the political comes out of the needs of the reproduction, of the needs of the community. At 9 years old, there's a decision about, okay, what is your contribution to the community, right? And there are mechanisms, structures. For example, the Fiesta. The Fiesta is not just having a good time, getting drunk, having a good time, dancing and so on. No, the Fiesta, she described, is an important element of the reproduction of the community, because it is a moment where the community commits itself again to itself. It's a moment of resignification of the community, right? And so this explains why, for instance, the Fiesta is prepared with a lot of care, because it's not just a moment of letting go, having a good time, but it's a moment when something is expressed that is fundamental to the reproduction of the community, fundamental to the building of the solidarity and the understanding of who are we and what are we going to do, right? So she analyzes these structures that are part of the reproduction of everyday life and what they mean and why they have been so powerful that they have enabled this community, for example, to survive, to not lose the land, even through a lot of changes, but not being able to hold on to some of their land. And I will send the title. I'll send the title to Brian.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all your wisdom with us this evening. And this conversation will continue. There have been several threads of the conversation.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. And thanks everybody. A big hug to everybody.
Indeed. And several threads of the conversation that people are planning on continuing on another platform. Just a reminder about tomorrow morning. We're starting again at 10 a.m. and it'll be the first of 2 sessions of a class that I'm teaching along with Grace Gershuni, focused on themes of climate justice and food justice. And we'll be talking about issues. We'll be talking about the evolution of various movements, many threads continuing from the conversation this evening. So look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the same time that we've been beginning all along.
Very good. Unfortunately, I cannot join you because, again, it's a complicated story with dealing now with a person with one arm. But you stay well, and the best to all of you. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Ah, sì.